All right. Yeah, today is Earth Day. Earth Day started like in the late 1980s, I think. I don't know. It's been around for a while. All right. So I want to give you a sense of perspective. You good? It's all right. I want to give you. I want to give you some perspective as to what you're going to see. I'm going to show you a video. It's like 10 minutes, which is longer than I normally show, but it's one of the craziest stories in all of forever. It almost seems like it's fake, but it's real. So here is this is like we'll go back to the equator. So here's like the equator up here, North America, South America. So the Southern Atlantic Ocean. You good? And then this is Antarctica. The South Pole is here. The places that they talk about in the video. So this is about an expedition that Ernest Shackleton launched, and the plan was to cross Antarctica. So in order to do a crossing of Antarctica is to cross the full distance of the continent. The plan was to leave this island here, which is called South Georgia Island, and it's actually a pretty big island um, between Antarctica and South America. They left by ship from South Georgia Island to land in Antarctica, and then the plan was because they were going to cross Antarctica by foot from this side to this side, they figured they wouldn't be able to take enough supplies for the full trip. So the plan was to take a ship from here to here and then travel inland one third the distance, leave a bunch of supplies, travel back, and then take the ship around and then get on to land and then traverse across Antarctica with enough supplies to make it to that other place and then resupply and then go the rest of the way. And like, we made it. But what you're going to see is they never made it to Antarctica. So the ocean down here is very cold, and there's a current which flows in this direction. And part of the issue about ice near coasts is that if there's sea ice or glacial ice that's in the water, that ice gets carried by the current. So the problem is you might not have an open shoreline to get to, and you constantly have sea ice which travels. So these distances are pretty big, and I've got this other map here. So this is a map. I'll leave this up so you can see. But basically, this is the beginning point, and you got to really pay attention to the dates on this. So December 5th, 1914. But in the southern hemisphere, December is like the middle of the summer. So it's like the warm season in the southern hemisphere. And this direction of the sailing is not, they went from here to here, but you don't go in a straight line because there's a current which flows in this direction. So you follow the direction of the current. It's a slightly greater path length, but the current helps you out. This is the place where they get trapped in ice. Anyway, and then the rest of the story goes from here up to here, and then up to the top, and then this is the place in Chile where they went. So this is a remarkable story, and it's probably like the craziest story of survival ever. Okay.
Ernest Shackleton was an Irish explorer. He's also the ultimate model for crisis management, which he became when his 1914 expedition met with what can only be described as complete and utter disaster. Their trip to the Antarctic showed the sheer magnitude of Shackleton's inspirational journey and has made him a pop culture icon of bravery and leadership. Today, we're going to take a look at what happened when explorer Ernest Shackleton was stranded in the Antarctic for years. But before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the Weird History channel and let us know in the comments below what other badass explorers you would like to hear about. Okay, bundle up because we are headed south, way south. Roald Amundsen and Robert Scott had already reached the South Pole in 1914. So if Ernest Shackleton was going to leave his mark, he'd have to do something else. Eventually, he decided to attempt the first continental crossing of Antarctica. The trip was so lengthy, Shackleton would need two teams to complete it. One would leave from South America, the other would leave from Tasmania and land on the opposite side of the continent along the Ross Sea. Since the South American party wouldn't be able to carry enough supplies to make it completely across, the Tasmania party would have to cross nearly a third of the whole continent just to set up the necessary supply depot. It wasn't a terrible plan in theory, but the whole thing was rendered moot by Shackleton's failure to even reach Antarctica. Due to unusually cold temperatures, his ship became trapped in the ice. He was less than 100 miles from land, but it didn't matter. He would have to wait until the ice melted before he could reach the continent, which could take months. As if being stuck wasn't bad enough, Shackleton also had to prepare for the possibility that the pressure being exerted by the ice would crush his ship. He removed weight from the vessel, hoping that it would rise in the event the ice pushed together. If that didn't work, the ship would simply be crushed. The underwater sea currents exerted incredible forces, pulling both the ice and Shackleton's ship miles from shore. The frequent blizzards and freezing winds didn't help either. Shackleton and his crew could only wait, and wait they did, for 6 long, cold months. By the end of October, the ship had sustained significant damage to its stern. Within a few days, it was obvious the Endurance wasn't going to make it. On October 27th, Shackleton finally gave the order to abandon ship. With the loss of the Endurance, any hope of completing the original mission went with it. Shackleton's sole focus became getting his men back to civilization. And it wasn't going to be easy. The ship had drifted 1,186 miles in 281 days. That put the team about 350 miles from remote Paulet Island, the nearest outpost that could provide shelter and supplies. The group salvaged as much as possible before the ship sank, but with their supplies decreasing, they were forced to supplement their diets by eating seals and even penguins.
Okay, so by now, this is where the ship got stuck on ice, and the currents carried the ship along with the ice pack all the way up to here, which is hundreds of miles. They're literally out in the ocean on the ship that's sinking, kind of chilling on some pieces of ice, and they're like, "We're in big trouble. You just can't get out."
It's 1915.
Yeah, this is 10 months, 10 months sitting out. Like, holy crap, right? Like, they should be dead already. But the story gets so much better.
They spent almost a month salvaging before the ship finally disappeared beneath the icy water.
No one knows where they are.
Once it
They
was
have no idea.
gone, they headed out. Shackleton's plan was to march across the ice to the northern tip of Antarctica, and if the ice broke apart, they would take the lifeboats they salvaged from the Endurance. Once the ship sank, the main mission was over. And once that main mission was over, the sled dogs' days were numbered. Not only were they potential food, but the dogs actually consumed more meat than the men did, which made them a liability. On October 20th, 1915, Shackleton's second-in-command, Frank Wild, shot 5 of the dogs and the expedition's cat. By January of 1916, 30 dogs had been culled. And on March 30th, the last of the dogs were consumed. At that point, the men were so hungry and desperate that they didn't care what they were eating. Frank Wild would later comment, "I have known many men who I would rather have shot than these dogs." Shackleton and his team started by heading north across the ice floes, but his exact route was limited by ice and weather conditions. It wouldn't be until April that there would be breaks in the ice significant enough to allow the men to navigate their lifeboats in the open water. Though they were initially hoping to use the boats to reach Deception Island, the frequent exposure to the freezing seawater exhausted the men. So instead, on April 15th, they put ashore on a 7-mile-long beach of Elephant Island, a small island off the northernmost peninsula of Antarctica. It was the first time Shackleton and his men had stood on land in 497 days. It was also the safest they had been in months. Camping on dry land was exponentially safer than camping on an ice floe that could break apart at literally any moment. After assessing the situation, Shackleton eventually concluded that the only way to save his men would be to reach South Georgia Island and return with help. Unfortunately, the island was over 900 miles away, across some of the most turbulent oceans on the face of the earth.
So by now, they're on this tiny little island. No one knows they're there. It's like 35 people. And what they decided to do, get in a 20-foot boat and row it 800 miles in open ocean. $800 miles. You're just going to get in the Southern Ocean, just start rowing. It takes a while to get there, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so
And all
here's
Shackleton
that
had
part.
was a 20-foot long lifeboat. As if that wasn't hard enough, Finding the tiny outpost that measured just 100 miles long and 20 miles wide would require exacting navigation using only a chronometer and a sextant. The lifeboat was fitted with a mast and loaded up with a month's worth of supplies. Why just a month? Well, Shackleton reasoned that by then he should have succeeded or died. Along with 5 other men, he set sail on April 24th. Frank Wild was left in command of the 22 men who stayed behind. If Shackleton didn't return by the following spring, they would try to reach an uninhabited whaling outpost on Deception Island. Shackleton's ship traveled about 60 miles a day, and the sailors were quickly drenched by the rough seas. They would spend the next few weeks wet and frostbitten, their skin raw and continuously irritated by the seawater. On the 5th day, they were hit by a powerful gale that threatened to capsize the ship and brought cold temperatures that froze the water on the boat in heavy layers. This ice needed to be constantly chipped off, and any excess weight, including their frozen sleeping bags and spare oars, had to be tossed overboard to maintain speed. The sun came out on the 7th day, by which point they had traversed about 350 miles. The next few days were calm, but day 11 brought another gale that almost sank them. Finally, just 14 days after leaving Elephant Island, the crew spotted South Georgia Island. You'd think it'd be celebration time, but the team couldn't find a suitable area to land, so they had to spend yet another night enduring hurricane-force conditions on their tiny boat. The next day, they made landfall at King Haakon Bay, but the ordeal wasn't over. King Haakon Bay sits on the unsettled southern side of the island. With their rudder broken and their ship leaking, the team didn't think they could reach the other side of the island in a boat. Instead, they would have to cross on foot. This meant an unprecedented journey that would require traversing rocks, ice, and glaciers that reached 5,000 feet in elevation, all in deep snow. But they had no choice. 3 of the men were too weak to make.
So the deal is they land on South Georgia Island, but the ship was so bad, the boat was so badly damaged, the rudder was broken, and the seas were so bad that they were like, the whaling station's on the northern side of the island. They're like, are we going to take a chance to try to like row around the island? Because it turns out in shallow water, the waves are even worse, you know? They're like, that's too much of a chance. So they landed. They're like, we'll just climb over the mountain. But it's, so like Baldigo Mountain on the south side is 1,200 feet. This is 5,000 feet. And it's also like, it's terrible winter time. They're going up over the top of the mountain. So they go up over the top of the mountain and down to the whaling station. That's the next plan. And remember, there's still 22 guys hanging out back here, right? Just being like, okay, maybe they'll come for us.
To make the trip. So Shackleton took 2 others with him and left the others at the bay. They took 3 days worth of food, attached screws to the bottoms of their worn boots for traction, and left their sleeping bags behind. Their destination was the whaling station at Stromness. The only catch was Shackleton hadn't been there in 2 years, and he wasn't even completely sure the station was still populated. Nevertheless, the trio set out on May 19th at 2 a.m., under the light of a full moon. They spent most of their first day getting lost among the glaciers and had to retrace their steps. Finally, they decided to escape the high altitude by gliding down the steep incline, roped together. It worked, but they still had to overcome another 2,000-foot glacier and a 25-foot waterfall before reaching the outskirts of Stromness. After their months-long ordeal, the 3 men weren't looking so hot. Their clothes were filthy, tattered, and all 3 had long hair and beards. When they ran into 2 children on their way to the station, they got a predictably amusing response. Shackleton asked the children for the station manager by name, at which point the kids' eyes went wide with fear, and they turned and ran in the opposite direction. When Shackleton did finally track down the station master, the man had no idea who he was, despite the fact they had met before. The 3 men Shackleton left behind at King Haakon Bay were quickly retrieved by a whaling ship from Stromness. But rescuing the other 22 men that stayed behind on Elephant Island would be much more difficult. With the First World War raging, the British government didn't have much in the way of resources to spare. Shackleton tried reaching Elephant Island in a whaling ship, but he had to turn back when he encountered a barrier of solid ice. He would try and fail 3 more times. Finally, the Chilean government stepped in and provided a small tugboat called the Yelcho. It set off on August 20th, and 5 days later, just as the 22 men on Elephant Island were preparing for a lunch of penguin breast and stewed seal bones, the Yelcho arrived. The men could see the Ocho lower a smaller boat into the water. As it drew near, it became clear who was driving it, Ernest Shackleton. As he approached, he yelled, "All well?" Frank Wild called back to him, "All safe, all well." Within an hour, all 22 men were headed back safely to Punta Arenas, Chile. Because of the war, Shackleton's return to Britain didn't receive much attention. Shortly after he got back, he volunteered for the army and was eventually involved in efforts in both Norway and Russia. Once the war was over, Shackleton borrowed some money from a college classmate to mount yet another expedition to Antarctica. This time, he intended to circumnavigate the continent. However, Shackleton's health was deteriorating in the years leading up to this expedition, and on January 4th, 1922, shortly after arriving on South Georgia Island, he suffered a fatal heart attack. His wife requested that he be buried in a small cemetery on that island, where he rests to this day. So what do you think? Could you survive a Shackleton expedition? Let us know in the comments.
All right, so they left here December 5th, 1914, and then finally everybody's rescued. They got them all back September 1916. So that's 2 years and 9 months. Not a single person died. No one died.
What the dogs did, though.
Except for the dogs. But if they hadn't shot and eaten the dogs, that. So the issue is, they took food for the dogs, but the dogs are eating more food than the people are, and they're like, yo, we're running out. And then the point of the dogs was they were the sled dogs taking stuff across the ice, and you don't need them anymore. It comes down to survival. So then it turns out that the Shackleton got enough money, had another, was going to do another run for it, but this time he's like, we're going to sail from here, get down to here, and we're going to take sled dogs around the entire continent. And just as they were about ready to leave, he died. So they never, finally did it. But it's an amazing story. It's also kind of a sad story, but talk about survival, just crazy impossible. Also, when they get up here and they're going to be rescued, they're like, yo, England, can you throw us a bone and help us out? And they're like, yeah, we're in the middle of a world war. They're like, what are you talking about? They're like, because they were like, oh yeah, we've been out sitting on the ice for a couple of years. There's a, World War I is on, so the resources weren't available. This circular motion here, that's in order for them to get from Elephant Island to South Georgia Island, because you're rowing a boat using primitive sails, you need the advantage of currents. You might notice that the distance from here to here is about the distance from here to here. So why would you leave here and head out to some basically empty island where there might be some sailors who are whaling, when you could just leave and go to Chile, which is well populated? And the issue is there's a current going in this direction. So if you leave here and you try to row this way, you can only make 2 miles an hour. There's a 2 mile an hour current. You're not going anywhere. But if there's a 2 mile an hour current going this way, and you can row 2 miles an hour, now you're making 4 miles an hour. Now you're making progress. They knew that, but that's a heck of a gamble. And the only time they could navigate is at night. You got to wait for the sun to go down and the stars to come out, and then you can use a sextant to measure your position relative to the stars, which is actually very easy when you're at the equator. But it's really hard when you're at the pole, because the pole is just kind of rotating around an axis. You don't get as much of the sky view. It's far more difficult. So they were also leaving here, traveling out over open ocean. South Orkney Islands were known and are even closer, but it's not a place where there were whaling ships. So they would have just got to another island and been like, okay, we're at another island. So they made that trip, and that's where they got to. So that's probably one of the most remarkable stories of early oceanography and survival. Frankly, they should have all died. That should have been it, and they never would have been found. The ship would have gone down. That would have been it. It was just all over with, They've been like, hey, shouldn't those guys be back by now? They're like, yeah, they should. Anybody see them? No. And then it would have been a mystery that just never would have been solved. But yeah, so there are more documentaries you can read and see about it. There's whole books written about the whole thing. Books written from the perspective of different people who were on the expedition. And it's very well historically documented. see some Shackleton. Yeah, you can also find there was a recreation of the expedition across South Georgia Island a few years ago, and it was like, people with far more modern technology and better equipment, and they still that like walk over the top of the island at that time of year, not a good deal. Not fun times. It's not like a trail. You're waist high in snow. The thing about the whaling station, you might know, you should know that before like our modern, crude oil and electricity and stuff, one of the main sources of lighting and heating for the modern world was using whale oil. So whales were hunted in large populations. And then you render down the fat from the whale, you make whale oil. Whale oil is used in lamps to light inside houses, even like city streets, like the lamps along city streets to light streets at night. That was whale oil. Whale oil was the most common thing. Whales were hunted to, very small populations near extinction just for their oil. And it turns out that when you discover oil on land, the Drake well out in Titusville, you can like, oh, we can just drill a hole in the ground and crude oil comes out. That's a whole lot easier than risking our lives going up by ship in the Southern Ocean to go like harpoon whales, drag them back to land, render the fat down. That's a lot of extra work. So the whaling has not been the whaling industry died all of a sudden. You know what I mean? They're like, that's that. We're not doing that anymore. The whalers are like, oh, thank goodness, that was a bad deal. Oftentimes, whaling ships where got lost all the time. They would go out for, weeks to months at a time. Newport, Rhode Island was a very important whaling station. There's a whaling museum in Newport, Rhode Island. If you're a big fan of sea shanties, a lot of those relate to the whaling days. All right, so if you didn't get the El Nino web quest done, I know that. So, yeah, a couple of the questions in there relate to trends, and those trend maps change from year to year because they're predictive maps. The one says about wet and warm conditions, and there isn't something that's both wet and warm, but you'll find things that are wet and things that are warm, or places maybe between somewhere wet and warm where it would be a good indication of warm and wet